It's my special privilege to welcome you all today on behalf of the United Nations Association for the National Capital Area to this very important conference on the global goals for sustainable development. You have a program here and you can read the subtitle for yourself, but we have in UNNCA made this an important theme of our work for the last couple of years, and clearly it's going to be a very important part of our programming for the rest of this year. So as we celebrate UN Month for the entire month of October and this special year of the 70th anniversary of the United Nations, this is a very significant program because in many ways what the United Nations did on September 25th of this year may be the boldest action in 70 years that organization has ever undertaken, establishing these global goals for sustainable development. And just as the United States was so essential to the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco, so is U.S. leadership critical to achieving these goals over the next 15 years. And so we are very pleased today to have experts from all sectors, government and nonprofit, civil society, private business, to help us think through how the U.S. can be a constructive partner in achieving these goals, both locally in our own country and globally. Now, those of you who aren't members of UNNCA, please come join us. You know, there's a lot of ignorance and misunderstanding about the United Nations around this country and even in Washington, D.C. So we need your help. And our mission is quite simple. We increase public understanding of the work of the United Nations and its values. We work for constructive U.S. leadership in the United Nations. And we hope to prepare the next generation of global citizens. So come join us. Check out our website, unanca.org. You've probably heard of our flagship Global Classrooms program, reaching 3,000 students throughout the area and culminating in a Model UN at the State Department, the largest outside event hosted by the State Department each year. You may have heard about our young professional career development programs. And there are dozens of other programs that we offer during the year. So if you're not a member, come join us. If you are a member, come to some of our programs and activities and help us do our job to increase public awareness of the United Nations and the work that it does. Now, I'd like to say thank you at the beginning rather than at the end where you're all still fresh. And I want to thank especially our Global Goals Sustainable Development Task Force, all the members of it, but especially our two chairs, Ed Elmendorf, Ed's out here somewhere, and Steve Mosley, who you'll hear from later. I also want to thank Paula Boland, our executive director, and her staff for the wonderful work she's done in organizing this conference here today. And especially the George Washington University Graduate School of Education and Human Development. Mary Futel is on our board and has always been a helpful liaison to this wonderful university, and we thank you for the venue today. We thank Mojo Productions for videotaping this event so that we can provide the enlightening discussion we're going to have to a larger audience. And especially I want to thank our speakers and our very distinguished panel for taking the time. Some of you have come far at your own expense to participate today, and we deeply appreciate it because, quite frankly, we have to deal with a lot of symptoms in this world, but we also have to deal with the root causes of conflict, of unrest, and of suffering around the world. And it's a tough and challenging assignment, but this organization, UNNCA, is very dedicated to continuing to work both locally and globally on these issues as partners with the rest of the world. Now, at this point, it's my pleasure to introduce our two very distinguished members here today. First of all, our keynote speaker, Tony Tempeh, is the U.S. Special Coordinator for the Post-2015 Development Agenda. He's the International Policy Advisor in USAID's Bureau of Policy. And you can read his complete biography in your program, so I'm not going to read it to you and save a little time. But it's pretty clear from his long career in nonprofit and academic work, in development, assistance, disaster recovery, and community development that he is well prepared for what I believe will be the most challenging assignment of his career so far. And as to moderate our panel and lead the discussion after Mr. Tempeh's remarks, we have Ambassador Elizabeth Coussens, the Deputy Chief Officer of the United Nations Foundation, formerly U.S. Ambassador to the UN Economic and Social Council, and alternate representative to the UN General Assembly in 2012 to 2014. And in that capacity, she led the U.S. negotiations on the post-215 agenda. So we couldn't ask for two more experienced and knowledgeable people to address this very important issue. And at this time, I'd like to turn the platform over to Tony Pippa, and then Ambassador Coussens will take over from there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Bliss, for that introduction and for the invitation to be here today. And thanks also to Ed Elmendorf and Stephen Mosley, as he mentioned, the co-chairs of the UNADCA Sustainable Development Goals Task Force. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's also fitting to be participating in today's program with Ambassador Elizabeth Coussens. I was privileged to be her partner when I was at USAID, and she was leading the U.S. during the negotiations of the Open Working Group, which came up with the goals and targets that, with just a few tweaks, are really the Sustainable Development Goals. And I was further privileged to succeed her when she left government and take that baton and continue on the path of active and constructive engagement that she forged for the U.S. As I led the U.S. in the negotiations, the intergovernmental negotiations this year, as the UN sought to come to consensus on this agenda. And as you know, we did achieve a consensus. It was just 4 weeks ago, President Obama, with more than 150 of his counterparts across the world, joined together in adopting the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And it's a remarkable consensus when you think about it, since it emerged from an unprecedented, inclusive, and transparent process over a course of several years. With the active involvement of the General Assembly in developing these goals, and it included not just member states, but also experts and academics, civil society, businesses, and other stakeholders. And in fact, the Secretary General has called it among the most inclusive processes in history. And so the global commitment that the 2030 Agenda represents, a political consensus among 193 member states to end extreme poverty in this generation while living sustainably and in peace. I think at the very beginning, it just really reaffirms the hope that's inherent in the founding of the United Nations 70 years ago, and it stands as a positive reaffirmation of the promise of the multilateral system. The summit, and there was quite a bit of political attention during the summit where the goals were adopted. We had celebrities, pop stars, concerts, soccer players doing things called dizzy goals. I think it really represents a politically optimistic moment. And an opportunity in the midst of other types of tensions, conflict, and instability happening in the world. And while these are global goals, they are also goals that reflect core American values and priorities: ending extreme poverty and want, protecting basic human rights, securing freedom for all. And that's by design. The U.S. played a very active role in these negotiations to shape the outcome. And I think the reason's simple. You know, as President Obama said at the United Nations during the adoption of the goals, development works. We recognize that our investments in sustainable development around the world and at home are investments in our own prosperity and our own security. We know that the world achieved significant progress during the time of the Millennium Development Goals, which these global goals succeed. Achieving more than a 50% reduction in extreme poverty, more than a 50% reduction in preventable child deaths, getting the same number of girls as boys to attend primary school worldwide. This is real progress. And no one presumes that it was the MDGs that were the sole cause of this progress. But our experience with the MDGs really did demonstrate the power of global goal setting. It's clear they helped governments, NGOs and civil society, the private sector, and other stakeholders get on the same page. They made it easier for the world to collectively follow its progress by driving data analysis, collection, and standardized monitoring. and that they served as the basis for mobilizing action and creating innovative partnerships, some of which we take granted today, things like the Global Fund for HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, the Gavi Alliance. It's really the idea of the MDGs and focusing on what progress was or wasn't happening, frankly, that helped provide some of the impetus for these partnerships. So just one example that I like to talk about, and certainly this is on the international side, because the MDGs were focused primarily in developing countries. But take, for example, what we've called through USA the Child Survival Call to Action. So by 2012, we recognized that the world had not been making sufficient enough progress on meeting MDG number 4, which is to reduce the deaths of children around the world in their first 5 years of life. So we came together to draft an action plan. It's called the Child Survival Call to Action. It was spearheaded by India, Ethiopia, United States, and UNICEF, and eventually joined by 173 other countries and over 400 organizations. The U.S. itself doubled down on its investments in 24 countries, and 6 of those priority countries have now achieved MDG 4, which was an extraordinary turnaround. And just in the time period since, it's estimated in the 2 years succeeding the call to action that 500,000 children's lives were saved in those 2 years. So that gives you a sense of the power of what global goal setting and the evidence and focus and can provide, how it can mobilize action, the sort of progress that it can help us with. But the new global goals go further than the MDGs. So we now seek to end extreme poverty, to end chronic hunger, to end preventable child deaths, to end preventable maternal mortality. We're looking for an HIV/AIDS-free generation. We're focusing on the quality of education, not just access. These are all things that were part of the original MDGs, but those were about relative improvements. Now we're looking to take them the rest of the way and to finish those. And the SDGs are not just about MDGs 2.0 as well. They take the focus of the MDGs on human development and with their focus on sustainability, add economic and environmental dimensions. So the way I see it, the MDGs were perhaps the cornerstones, like a first order of business focused on developing countries, but the SDGs, by contrast, represent a comprehensive foundation for sustainable development, one that's relevant for all countries and not just for developing countries. The SDGs include key development priorities like climate change, sustainable energy, environmental sustainability, and inclusive economic growth. And among other things, they expand and strengthen a focus on gender equality and incorporate the critical importance of good governance, justice, peace and security, successful development, much of which was missing in the original MDGs. And so while this takes us to 17 goals, whereas the MDGs had 8, the addition of all these areas is a significant step forward. It both deepens and broadens the ambition. It also better reflects the evidence that's shown development to be complex and that has shown progress often to be integrated. While the agenda's targets may appear to be standalone objectives housed in sector-specific goals, they all both depend on and influence many other parts of the framework. So for example, to address malnutrition, we now recognize that we must work through school systems. We must account for parents' economic incentives, address the availability of, the access to, and the knowledge of using healthy, nutritious products. So this focus on integration breaks down the silos of the MDGs and forces those of us pursuing these goals to avoid making trade-offs that prioritize progress on one goal at the expense of poor performance on another. It's also a set of goals that every country, regardless of the level of development, is voluntarily endorsing. These are goals to be universally applied in the US as well as any other country. And as the President remarked when he committed the United States to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, all of our nations have work to do. Here in this country, the wealthiest nation on earth, we're still working every day to perfect our union and to be more equal and more just and to treat the most vulnerable members of our society with value and concern. So the inclusivity and the transparency of this process, the public attention that's been focused on it at the outset, the integration across the agenda, and this embrace of universality, they all mark an evolution and draw fundamental differences between the global goals for sustainable development and the MDGs. So it's a pleasure to be here today as we get the conversation underway in earnest about implementation and as we explore the link between these global goals and local action. And I'd just like to share a few reflections about the goals that might help to get that conversation started. So first, the global goals consciously acknowledge the importance of action at the subnational level. In fact, we have a whole goal on cities and human settlements, Goal 11, which is make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. By 2030, we can expect another 1.5 billion people to be living in urban areas. And as stated in USAID's own policy on sustainable service delivery in an increasingly urbanized world, which was published just a couple of years ago in 2013, because cities are the engines of economic growth, accounting for 70% of global gross domestic product, we need to ensure that safe, sustainable cities improve the livelihoods of those who dwell within them and who depend on the economic activity they generate. The MDGs were set as global aggregates, but the global goals for sustainable development account for countries setting their own benchmarks and mapping their own contributions towards these goals. So this is going to allow for far greater differentiation, which can translate into greater differentiation at the subnational level as well. And it's very interesting to see efforts already, like One NYC in New York City. It's a local vision of the SDGs. The city's One NYC plan was developed with locally focused goals and initiatives that join economic and environmental sustainability with social inclusion, similar to the global goals. And it's a major sustainability plan that attempts to link up with the international goals in a comprehensive way. As key staffers who helped develop it say, the way to meet the SDGs globally is to meet them locally. And so it'll be interesting to hear the conversation about how we think about that. And in fact, in the US, this means that in addition to working with the National Security Council and my counterparts on the international side, we've also been engaging with the Domestic Policy Council about what implementation of the SDGs can mean in the US and how they map to where the priorities have been for the US government in the United States. And second, this focus on universality and inclusivity really moves us beyond aid, beyond the traditional donor-recipient dichotomy to a framework of shared responsibility and collective action. It provides a strong expectation of country and local ownership and leadership, owning their own social and economic development. And it makes clear that this chapter of development can't just be about what national governments spend, but has to harness the connectivity and the resources of businesses, philanthropies, NGOs, faith communities, citizens, and communities themselves. This is really an agenda that goes just beyond the resources of governments only, and really has to leverage the resources that society itself brings to the table. And it's an approach reflected in the consensus that was reached prior to the adoption in September of the global goals that was reached at the third Financing for Development Conference in Addis in July, which showcased a lot of multi-stakeholder partnerships with investments by business and philanthropy and civil society, as well as efforts to catalyze significant increases in domestic and local resources so that countries increase their own resources to invest responsibly in the types of services that will address the development needs they have. It's an approach that also reflects our focus on the importance of innovation, on science and technology, and the power of data that can help accelerate our progress. So it's truly a modern approach, and it's the one that now really serves as the roadmap for the global community to follow. So as the global goals take hold, you might anticipate the expansion or new application of models such as the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, which is a network of the world's cities taking action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the almost 80 cities in that network are a mix of developed and developing countries in all regions. The Rockefeller Foundation is pursuing its 100 Resilient Cities as an initiative that also engages local governments, and that also crosses developed and developing countries. Finally, the focus on indicators and evidence through the global goals provides for accountability and for the engagement of multiple stakeholders, including civil society and citizens themselves, in holding local and national leaders accountable for the commitments made to the goals. But that focus on evidence also goes beyond accountability to provide a platform for sharing and the application of lessons learned about successes and failures that crosses boundaries in interesting ways. It's interestingly reminiscent of an initiative started by USAID in 1994, 6 years before the MDGs, called Lessons Without Borders, which was focused on bringing some of the best practices being implemented by USAID to bear on America's most pressing problems. It provided a chance to share experiences from domestic and international programs, to find out what works best and develop cost-effective solutions to common problems. In just one example, by adopting social marketing techniques from Kenya, immunization rates in the city of Baltimore went from 62% to 96%, which is one of the highest in the country at that time. So I'm not suggesting that we restart Lessons Without Borders tomorrow, but I think the new global goals and this focus on evidence and the focus on lessons provides us the impetus to think about how we use this political moment to leverage the lessons being learned anywhere in the world and apply them to our own domestic context, and to share what's working well in our own domestic context and apply them elsewhere. So as someone who helped negotiate this outcome, I recognize that the new goals and this framework are imperfect, and I know only too well all of their foibles. But they do give us an opportunity to think and act locally in a way that links to the global aspirations that they capture on common social, economic, and environmental goals. It's one where we should take full advantage, now that we have that consensus, to start exploring those links as we implement and make it real. So I look forward to today's conversation. Thank you, and onward to 2030.